Hello, and welcome to Two Pews in a Pod. Join us as we explore faith in a modern world at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Now, here is your host, Pastor Paul Baglios.
I'm Paul Baglios, and I'm happy to welcome you watching and you listening again to this podcast of Evangelical Lutheran Church, Two Pews in a Pod. Today we are going to have the first of two planned episodes about the Barnabas Ministry of Evangelical Lutheran Church, and I am joined by four members of the congregation who are very active participants in that ministry. I'm going to ask all of you to introduce yourselves, your names, and how long you've been involved in this.
Hi, I'm Nancy Luce, and I can't remember how long I've been involved. It's been a couple of years anyway.
And I'm Linda Coe, and I've been involved for a little over 2 years.
I'm Mary Meeker, and I'm a newbie, about a year.
My name is Dick Basford, and I've been involved since Barnabas Ministry was began, and I'm not quite exactly sure how long that was, but since it started.
Well, we're going to talk about that during this episode, but I want to acknowledge that Linda Coe is not only one of our Barnabas ministers, but currently also serves to facilitate and organize this ministry, a role in which she has been excellent. Why don't you begin, Linda? For this episode, we want to talk with all who are listening or viewing. What is Barnabas Ministry? I think people of the congregation may be familiar with hearing that term, but not necessarily know what it's about.
Okay. So for our church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland, the Barnabas Ministry started, from what I understand, as a program to encourage people, as Barnabas was an encourager, to get through challenges of life. And we serve those in the congregation who are unable to attend church on a regular basis for whatever reason, whether they are still living in their home, whether they're living in another facility, or whether perhaps they've had a long-term illness or maybe even a short-term illness that was extended to the point where they could not get back to church. So we are there to provide that gap or perhaps long-term service to encourage those in the congregation in that situation. Others of you might have another response for that, though.
Yeah, the one thing that I noticed that was kind of a common thread among the people that I go to visit is how much they miss being in church. That was a big part, aside from they also miss driving, but being able to go to church, and that's a lot of lament, like I wish I could get in there, but that they do appreciate that kind of the church is coming to them, where they live. I think that's like a big part of.
Exactly, and many of them ask, how pastor is and how certain people that we may know in common when we're visiting them, how they're doing, and how the church is doing in general. How many people were there and blah, blah, blah. And I'd like to take them a bulletin from the church along, which is just a little memento whenever I go. And it's just a little something. It's kind of nice to give them something from the church, and I think they do appreciate that each visit that I make. But.
So we're talking in all cases about members of the congregation who are older, no longer to be quite as active or mobile in ways they had previously been, especially when it comes to their ability to participate in person in the worship or other aspects of the congregation's life. Did you want to add anything, Mary? I just don't want to talk. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't want to talk over you, so say something smart.
That might take some time. No, but I'm thinking of the people I visit, and just what Dick said. I bring the bulletin, And every single time, she is so grateful just to have something so simple like the church bulletin that we take for granted. I know I do. You walk in and we have two different ways we can look, or we can have a bulletin, and some tangible part of the church that she's very grateful for.
Yeah, and one of the women that I see, I took her a bulletin, and it had her name mentioned in the prayers that we do, and so she was thrilled to see that she's not forgotten, that she shows up in the bulletin.
And that's maybe one of the main reasons for our visitation, is so that they know they are not forgotten. Mm-hmm. They still are a integral part of our fellowship here at the church, and they usually ask questions, and hopefully everybody else is asked questions. Mostly they ask what's going on at the church. That's the second thing they ask after hello and welcome and all this kind of stuff. But they still are interested in what's happening here on Church Street.
Well, as one of you mentioned a moment ago, this is a way of being church with people when they are no longer able to be here in the place where we most frequently gather together as a community in Christ. And I want to be quick to point out that among those tangible points of connection, this is also a sacramental ministry, that Barnabas ministers carry Holy Communion to those they visit. Talk a little about how that works, how we are set up with communion kits, how those are used, how those are refreshed and resupplied.
I actually brought one with me.
Here we go.
Got mine too.
Yeah.
They don't all look the same, but they generally all have, mine has gluten-free wafers in it, as well as regular wafers, and then a container for the wine or grape juice, and the small cups. I always make it a choice for the individuals that I'm visiting, and there are times when people refuse for whatever reason. They're not feeling well, they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel ready to commune on that particular day. And I always value their input and accept that. It's not my agenda. I'm there to serve them, and I want to do what's right. In those situations, I often, and I know Dick and I have talked about this, there are sometimes people that cannot communicate and are unable to receive communion. And I always pray with them whether they can participate in that or not. I just wanted to also share that our church staff are so supportive, and they've prepared a Holy Communion bulletin for us to do the entire shortened version of providing the communion to our individuals that we're visiting.
Yes. And to add a little bit of what Linda said, one of the sad times that we have as Barnabas ministers is sometimes our folks, the end of life is approaching, and they find it difficult to take communion. And I think maybe sometimes I make the choice not to offer it when that time comes, and that's a difficult decision, and I think we've talked about how to handle that, but it just kind of happens naturally. We can see that things are not as they were. But I think the communion is something that's very important to them, and so we're happy. I think that's probably one of the most important things that we do is offer Holy Communion to our members when we visit them.
Which we understand to be the extension of the sacrament at the center of this congregation's life every week here at ELC. I have been in some congregations, not as pastor but as a member, where something similar was done, and every worship service there would be communion kits that had been freshly supplied, which would be on the altar, and at the end of the service, those who were going to take communion to others who couldn't be there would would be sent out with a blessing. We don't do that here, in part because this particular ministry is much larger than what I have seen in other congregations. And the reason we're doing this podcast is that recently at a gathering of our Barnabas ministers, I made the comment I so often make: I can't believe every congregation doesn't do this. It is such a gift to those who are served, and it is such a gift, I know, to me, called to be the pastor of the congregation. There are so many people of this congregation, and your visits are not in place of mine, but in partnership and in addition to my own. But it means that people can be assured of regular connection from their congregation and not have to wait simply until the pastor is able to make the rounds, which here could take a year. And it's invaluable. And Linda had said, well, how might we get the word out that maybe other congregations could hear about this? And I thought, let's start with a podcast and see what interest that may generate.
Yeah, I think the distribution of communion is probably the most important thing that we do. And I think they also look forward to us coming. Occasionally, people will say no, but most of the time they're very eager to receive communion. And I'm certainly feel very privileged and honored to do that, for our church.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll say one of the ways that we work together, this Barnabas Ministry team, I know with the pastoral ministry of the congregation, and now that will also include on occasions our recently called, soon-to-be ordained deacon-elect Megan Wyant, is that our Barnabas ministers, did you mention this already, Linda? That currently there are 13 members of the congregation who are involved in this ministry serving as Barnabas ministers, and currently there are 28 members of the congregation who are receiving the ministry of visitation and Holy Communion distribution from our Barnabas ministers. I made a detour in my verbiage, and now I can't remember what the main flight was. It'll come back to me. Say something smart again, Mary.
I wanted to share
Yeah.
that you provide a recommendation for those that will be assigned as Barnabas recipients.
That's the point I was starting to make, and got distracted when I talked about how many are serving as Barnabas ministers and how many are being cared for by this ministry. That often Barnabas ministers, all of whom will complete within our membership records notes about who they have visited, when each person has last received Holy Communion. And sometimes our Barnabas ministers will, after a visit, get a hold of me and say, I just saw so-and-so, and I think maybe they might appreciate your visit, which is a wonderful way to be in a partnership of care. And in other situations, as you just mentioned, Linda, I'll know of things that are occurring for people of the congregation, and then as the facilitator and organizer of this ministry, I'll say, I think maybe this person would appreciate receiving the care of our Barnabas ministry.
And then I generally will ask an individual in our group that I think might be willing or a great match for that type of individual, and it's just something that I'm trying to find a match for. We'll talk about it, and then in some cases, the potential future Barnabas minister will ask me to call them first and say, are you okay with this?
Yeah.
And generally it's yes, or
Yeah.
sometimes it's, oh, that's a friend of mine. I went to high school with that person. And we have that in our congregation.
I don't know if I tell all of you often enough how very often when I am visiting somebody who is receiving the care of our Barnabas Ministry team, how they speak with gratitude and appreciation for this ministry. All of you are people who I have heard named in appreciation when I've been visiting. And a funny story, I'll mention the name of Ken Willard, another member of this congregation who is one of our Barnabas ministers. The other week, I had scheduled for myself a series of visits. This was purely by coincidence. I wasn't aware of this or wasn't thinking about it as I set out on those visits. I was going to see 3 different people, all of whom are those that Ken Willard visits, and he had just been there, either the day before or earlier in the day. And when I finished my visits that day, I called him and I said, I've just spent an entire day in your footsteps. Wherever I've gone, people have said, oh, Ken Willard was just here. And,
Oh, that's really nice.
yeah.
And speaking of Ken, he's someone that always calls me instead of messages me, and he gives me a report after every one of his visits. Everyone has a different way of communicating back with me about their visits. Most people put it in an email or see me in church and tell me, but Ken is one that gives me a direct phone call, and he called me the same day. So there you go.
Well, I think, talking about how beneficial it is for them, I think it's reciprocal. I get such joy visiting my folks, and I get back just as much as I'm giving.
Yes.
And I think that's, the same for everyone.
I want to focus on that, Mary, in the next episode that we do in this 2-part series. Let me ask some more mechanical questions for people who are trying to understand more about how this works. So typically, and each of our Barnabas ministers does this according to their own preferences. This is not mandated. But typically, how often do you visit, and for how long?
Well, I have 2 people that I visit, and one, I try to get there at least once a month. A lot of times that doesn't happen exactly that way. And then I have another one that if I miss a week, then that's too much. So I see this person every week, and that just seems to work for her.
Go ahead.
No, I
Mary.
was just saying monthly is when I see.
I currently see people monthly or call on the phone. I have one individual who prefers not to see in person and does not wish to receive communion, but loves the phone call every month. In the past, though, I've had individuals who either when the health condition was changing and the family asked, could you come more frequently? So it was more like every 2 weeks for quite some time in some of those cases.
And I have 9 folks that I see, but many of them are at Homewood. 7 of them are there. So I go there and I spend about 2 days in the month, and I go from one to the other. And if one is not available, I'll go see somebody else. So it works out better. I just know I'm going to be there 2 days each month. And and then I have 2 other folks that are in different homes in the county, and I certainly try to get there once a month. Although I do call them because I don't call the folks at Homewood, I just stop in. But at the other folks, I do make appointments. And this past month, both of them said they were busy, or they weren't busy, they were not feeling well. So we had a chat on the phone for a while and told them I'd certainly be by in about 2 weeks because it had been a month. So, but that's kind of my routine, and it seems to work well. So.
Well, I want to thank all of you for this wonderful ministry that you do for people of this congregation, and the way that you are all good encouragement and support for one another and for me. This works very well. We're going to do another episode about our Barnabas Ministry, and we'll talk a little more about the joys and the difficulties of this work, what you experience as Barnabas ministers. Mary began to speak of that. That's certainly something that we want to come back to. But thank you for making the time to be here to record this episode. Again, I am Paul Baglios. Thank you to those of you watching or listening to this podcast episode. We hope you'll engage next time.
Nancy Luce, over and out.
Linda Coe.
Mary Maker.
Dick Basford.
Bye for now.
This has been Two Pews in a Pod, a podcast hosted by the lead pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.